There's been a lot of talk lately about fake news and false information. Well, one place you can go to make sure you get real information and learn real history and economics is Liberty Classroom. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn more. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Baron Socha about net neutrality. Baron is the president and founder of Tech Freedom. He was previously a senior fellow and the director of the Center for Internet Freedom at the Progress and Freedom Foundation. He has also practiced Internet and Communications law. You can follow his work at techfreedom.org and via the Tech Policy Corner page on Medium. You can find him on Facebook under Tech Freedom and on Twitter at Tech Freedom. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/net-neutrality. Baron, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So I think a logical place to start for this conversation is just with a definition, because there seems to be a lot of confusion about what net neutrality is, including from me. So let's start there. What is net neutrality?
Well, you're not wrong to be confused about what net neutrality is, because a lot of people have used it to mean a lot of different things. And I think it's part of the reason this conversation has been so difficult over the last decade and has not been resolved. The concept has grown over time. So originally, when it was an idea coined by Tim Wu, who happened to teach my internet law class back in 2002, when he was working on this idea, originally his idea was that broadband providers that provide your home internet service or your mobile service in later years had some sort of gatekeeper power and couldn't be trusted to exercise that. And so he wanted the federal government, and specifically the Federal Communications Commission, to enforce certain basic rules. Number one, a transparency rule about how they operate their networks. Number two, a rule that said they wouldn't block content, lawful content. And number three, that there would be a regulation of how they dealt with third parties like Google and Facebook and Twitter, which are called edge companies in this debate. There's this idea that the broadband companies are at the core of the network, and the tech companies that most of us use are the edge companies. And so the third rule has really been where most of the debate has been about exactly how you craft that. And in its strict form, net neutrality would mean that the broadband providers would just be dumb pipes, so to speak. They wouldn't do anything to any of the traffic on the network. They would transmit it passively. The network would be perfectly neutral. So that was the idea, and it has had a couple iterations over the years, starting under Republicans at the FCC. Bush's first chairman in 2004 gave a big speech about the four freedoms, the freedoms to use the devices you wanted, to connect to the sites you wanted, and so on. In 2005, there was a policy statement from Bush's second FCC chairman. The FCC started to require those principles to be followed by broadband companies when they merged. And then the big thing is that in 2007, 2008, there was a big hubbub over Comcast blocking or throttling, that is slowing down, BitTorrent peer-to-peer file sharing traffic on its network. And at that point, the FCC tried to bring an enforcement action against them. It did, in fact, and that failed in court in 2010 because the court said the FCC had to issue formal rules. They couldn't just enforce that policy statement from 2005. And then the FCC, in response, issued its first open internet order, the first net neutrality regulations, after Congress failed to legislate. And that, in turn, was struck down at the beginning of 2015 for lack of clear legal authority. And then the FCC, beginning of 2014, and the FCC at the beginning of 2015 issued a second set of rules. And so it's important to understand that history, because the answer to your question has changed at every step of the way. The concept has grown, and more things have been included under that term. We can talk about what those are, but it's important just to understand that there is not one net neutrality we're talking about here, but many, and the answer as to whether it's a good idea or what could be done about it really depends on what we're talking about and when in that debate we are standing.
Yeah, let's pick it up there. You said that more things have been included under the term net neutrality over time. So what are some of the things that we've seen added to this discussion that weren't a part of it originally? What things have become included as part of this that were not previously?
Well, in the first instance, the rule about how you deal with third parties, how you whether you discriminate unreasonably, that has always been unclear. Even in the 2010 rule, the rules said one thing, and that they appeared to leave room for reasonable network management or discrimination, and yet the order seemed to take a hard and fast rule and say basically that any sort of non-neutral arrangement, any kind of favoritism where you might prioritize certain traffic or give it any kind of different treatment would be illegal, and that in fact is why that order failed in court. So that's one thing that's always been fought over. The second is that the term itself has gotten tied up with the unrelated question of what legal authority the FCC has or should have. And so if your listeners have heard about Title II, that is a legal tool that the FCC in 2015 finally invoked at the behest of the president to regulate net neutrality, but it doesn't actually have anything to do with net neutrality as such, and yet that's become really part and parcel of this debate. And then there are other things like so-called zero rating or free data, where especially wireless companies may give away data on their networks, and the claim has been made that that violates net neutrality. And of course, it depends on how it works. If it's the T-Mobile program, where all video traffic, unless you opt out of the program, all video traffic gets downgraded or optimized to a quality level that is appropriate for a small screen and also consumes less bandwidth. Well, that, on some readings of the open internet rules, is a net neutrality violation, whereas other people like me would say, well, that's a good thing for consumers, and in fact, consumers end up consuming more video, but the network is run better because it's not being done at a higher bit rate than people really need. There's some other things like interconnection. That's most famously the example of Netflix, which at the beginning of 2014 made a big to-do about how they were claiming that they were being ripped off by Comcast, which was supposedly extorting money from them in exchange for handling Netflix traffic on the network better. Well, that's one way to look at it, but in fact, Netflix had always had to pay somebody for the infrastructure that carries all the data, and Netflix is something like 35% of total nighttime peak internet usage. And Comcast was offering them, in fact, a better deal than they were previously getting, a more efficient way of doing that, so they wouldn't have to pay a third party, because there are all sorts of other companies that work in the internet ecosystem to carry traffic, especially video. But it was claimed that was a net neutrality issue. So that's just, those are examples of how the concept of net neutrality has grown over time to include things that are beyond blocking, no transparency, and the basic idea that broadband providers shouldn't be picking winners and losers in a way that consumers cannot control. So I would just maybe summarize that all, because that was a very long answer, I apologize, by saying something more like, in the early days, net neutrality was supposed to be about user choice, and now, under some readings, like the example I gave you about T-Mobile, people are saying it doesn't matter whether users can choose or whether it's good for users or whether they have an opt-out. They just don't like it, so they want to ban it. And to me, that's crazy.
Sure. Now let's take a step back here and flesh out this a little bit more, because the whole issue of net neutrality, this whole discussion is going on because there are problems that supposedly exist that need to be solved. So let's talk about what those problems are a little bit more. So what exactly are all of the problems that supposedly need to be solved, and how do these net neutrality regulations attempt to solve those problems? And obviously you got into this a little bit in your previous answer, but I want to make sure that everyone is clear on what net neutrality, or at least people think of as net neutrality, is supposed to be fixing in the first place.
Well, we can talk about some specific examples, but I want to say at the outset, before I lose this point, that really, if you ask people, or if you listen to what was said over time, what they're really concerned about is, as I said at the outset, the idea that broadband providers have gatekeeper power because consumers don't have adequate choices among them. And to the extent that that's actually what people are talking about, there is another conversation that we could and should be having about how to make broadband deployment easier. And we're never going to get to a point where you're going to have 12 broadband providers to choose from, and maybe they have a wildly different range of practices, and if you don't like one, you can just choose another. That exists in some countries in Europe, but it's actually a mirage. It's an artificial form of competition where the government has mandated that a single monopoly network operate as a wholesaler, and that consumers can choose among various competing retailers. In the United States, we've taken a very different approach where we've encouraged competition based on separate facilities. There's a cable pipe to the home and a telephone pipe, and wireless is an option, satellite's an option, right? What I would like us to be talking about, and what I hope we can wind up with today, is talking a little more about how we could make it easier for additional companies to enter that market. And sometimes that might mean fiber to the home. A company like Google Fiber, for example, is installing a third pipe in major American cities. And that really changes the competitive dynamic. Even if it's just one more player, the things that people are concerned about their broadband provider doing, I think, are much less likely to happen. And then, of course, there's another generation of new broadband technology that's coming around the corner, where in the past, the bottleneck has been the last mile, because it's really expensive to actually wire homes and go from the neighborhood to the home, or even from the street into the home. Well, that debate's going to change significantly when 5G, next generation wireless, gets deployed and requires very dense networks, that is lots of antennas, but can deliver, if you put those up on street lamps and at that level of granularity, you can deliver essentially gigabit speeds to the home without actually having to do the expensive stuff of wiring the home. So that's a sort of side answer to your question, because it's not the net neutrality debate, it's rather the debate that has been ignored over the last 10 years so that everyone can have the net neutrality debate. So, getting to your question, what are the concerns? Well, they're not entirely illusory. I mean, it is true that Comcast was alleged quite credibly, although the case was never actually resolved, so there isn't a full record. But in 2007, 2008, it appears that Comcast was throttling BitTorrent peer-to-peer file sharing traffic, which was primarily being used for copyright infringement. And we could have a long debate about the copyright side of this, but suffice it to say that there's a real problem there, because if nothing else, Comcast was deceiving its customers. And so my point is not that there is nothing that government should do, but rather that we didn't need the FCC to invent this complicated regulatory scheme and to spend 10 years fighting about the FCC's legal authority to resolve that case, because in that case, there was a legal tool that was ready to be used, which is the Federal Trade Commission, is our nation's consumer protection watchdog, and has quite robust authority to police deceptive practices, or when companies promise they're going to live by certain commitments and don't, or do things that are harmful to consumers or that cause competitive harm. And the Federal Trade Commission was ready to bring an enforcement action, and the only reason it didn't was that essentially that there was a pissing match between the chairman of the two agencies. And so we've now spent the last 10 years arguing about how net neutrality should be implemented by the FCC, whereas, getting back to your original question, we could have had this issue resolved pretty neatly, where you could have had essentially a common law of broadband, if you want to call it net neutrality, fine, but a common law of how broadband gets policed, developed by a more competent agency. And it would have, I think, been perfectly adequate to address the real harms that people have about that sort of practice, or something that's actually anti-competitive, which is a lot of what people talk about. They say, well, what if a broadband provider favors their affiliate, a branch of the company or some company that they've done a deal with, and they don't make that available to others? Well, antitrust law can deal with a lot of those problems. Maybe not all of them, but if we'd started to go down that road, and if we dealt with these issues that way, you would have seen, where the legal shortfalls were, and primarily, much the same thing would have happened, which is that industry, which agreed on the 2010 and 2015 rules for the most part, right? Those are things that broadband providers have actually not questioned. They would have enshrined those same things in a code of conduct that would be directly enforceable by the Federal Trade Commission with no need to argue about the legal authority or what Congress should do. So again, this to me, it's not this is exactly a solution in search of a problem. It's that to the extent there are problems here, there were already solutions on the table, and we just didn't use them. And it's essentially been driven by political reasons, not real concern about consumers.
Yeah, and you obviously mentioned the antitrust laws and regulations that are on the books there, but what are some of the other laws that we've seen on the books that either could be used to regulate in this area or have been used in this area?
Well, so I should mention we actually have at least one real case of this, besides the case the FTC didn't bring about Comcast BitTorrent. So the issue about throttling and denying users the speeds that they were promised and slowing certain websites, that issue has been dealt with by both agencies. So back before the latest open internet order, which incidentally deprived the FTC of jurisdiction, so now it's just the FCC on the beat, you had both agencies policing broadband, and Federal Trade Commission actually went to court and was able to bring a successful case, and they didn't have to go through some of the pitfalls that people think they would have to go through. They don't always have to show consumer injury, so it's not as weak a regulator as people imagine. But it's not just the Federal Trade Commission. Those antitrust laws, those consumer protection laws, are also enforced at the state level. And you've seen in many examples in antitrust and consumer protection that state regulators can be actually quite active. And this is, in fact, a reason why, if anything, broadband providers wanted the FCC to get involved to preempt the states, right? They in a sense, wanted a federal baseline. And a federal baseline might be a good idea, but you can't have it both ways. You can't claim that there was no effective remedy, as people on the digital left tend to do, and yet also, when it suits you, then embrace the AGs and push them to bring lawsuits. So that's just a bit of an overview. If your listeners want more of a sense of this, they should really go back and reread. If you want to hear the other side of this debate, which has been ignored, you should reread the three Republican dissents that have been written on this issue. First, from Robert McDowell back in 2010. He did a pretty good job of laying out the toolkit of the many legal remedies that were available to deal with this set of problems. And then in 2015, you had two Republicans on the commission today who similarly laid out their concerns, although by then the debate was more about legal authority. And then finally, let's just remember that Congress legislates, right? So to the extent that you think that there is some problem that is not covered by existing law, there are ways to deal with this, and Republicans have repeatedly offered, or Congress has been close to, reaching a deal on net neutrality legislation that would give the FCC clear but narrow authority to police core net neutrality concerns. Republicans offered that deal 2 years ago, and it has been essentially sat on by Democrats. So to me, that really illustrates that this debate is really no longer about blocking and throttling and transparency. It's really about people who want to keep fighting, just as people on both sides of the gay marriage debate just want to keep fighting. They'll keep inventing new issues to fight over. And the FCC's legal authority, which people on the left want to be as broad as possible.
Friends, if you want to gain a deeper understanding of history, economics, political theory, the sorts of topics we cover on this show, then check out Liberty Classroom, featuring a wide variety of courses, including some that are taught by professors who have been guests on this show, such as Kevin Gutzman, Jason Jewell, and GP Manish. Liberty Classroom will provide you with videos, audio files, question and answer sessions, discussion forums, and all of the resources you need to become a better debater and have a deeper knowledge of American history, world history, economics, political theory, and more. Learn real history and economics right at your computer or on the go and be able to more confidently and clearly articulate your views. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to learn the information necessary to become a master debater for a mere 24 cents a day. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/liberty to find out more about Liberty Classroom and to help support the Wake Up Call podcast. All right, so I want to bring up an issue that you've touched on a little bit, but it seems to be one of the key issues in most people's minds whenever the net neutrality issue comes up, and that's the issue of prioritization. So what is meant by that, and is this actually a problem? How big of a problem is it?
Well, it's my basic point today, if you take away nothing else, is that none of these things are inherently good or bad, or at least maybe you could argue that blocking of content is inherently bad. So in legal terms, in antitrust law, for instance, there are two kinds of rules. There's a per se rule, which says something is inherently bad and should just be banned outright. That's a per se rule. It is per se illegal. No ifs, ands, or buts. And you could argue that blocking should be in that category. But with something like prioritization, what I'm saying is not that it shouldn't be regulated, but that we should have what would be called a rule of reason, where you weigh costs and benefits and you figure out whether it's a good idea on a case-by-case basis. And it depends. So so as an engineering matter, let's just be clear here, sometimes people talk about things like fast lanes. There are no separate lanes. As an engineering matter, and I'm not an engineer or technical expert, but I can tell you this much. What we're actually talking about is just as you have a router in your home that routes all of the traffic, that you have multiple Wi-Fi devices and so on, there are routers all throughout the internet ecosystem. So basically, at the end of every pipe, whether it's fiber or cable or copper pair, there is some kind of router, and there is congestion, or there can be congestion at that router. And the debate over prioritization is primarily a debate over how the router works and whether it gives priority to certain kinds of packets over others, so that those packets move through. So it's effectively a fast lane. It's just that image is very misleading. People imagine there's like a separate lane that gets built for certain kinds of content. Well, so the argument that we would make is that there are some kinds of traffic or services or applications where everybody wants that stuff to be prioritized, and in a market would be willing to pay for that, and that's not a bad thing. So, for example, it's basically going to be anything that is both, it has to be very, very, what we would call latency sensitive or jitter sensitive. So if there are certain sorts of interruptions in how the packets flow, because let's remember, just Internet 101, Internet Protocol, the way the Internet works is that computers just throw packets out across the Internet, not in a steady stream, but they throw them out on the network and hope that the packets get to their destination in time for the whole thing to work. And sometimes they get there late, right? And if you're just browsing the Internet, you don't really notice that. But if you're doing something like, let's say it's constant video streaming, or you're trying to do anything that's real time and it cannot be buffered in advance, you will see the packets that don't show up in time as a degradation in quality. And that degradation can sometimes be really bad. So if you're online gaming and it's real time and it's very data intensive, because there's a lot of imagery data that has to be sent across the network from one computer to many other computers, you could experience that congestion as dying on screen right in front of you, because the gameplay cannot keep up on your end. And if so, you would be perfectly happy to pay for prioritization, or to pay a little more to your gaming company who pays for prioritization. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't harm people who are just browsing the Internet or even watching online video that can be buffered. So some applications actually are more in need of prioritization, and all we say is that there should be the ability of consumers to get that, which ultimately, to work, requires a market. And that's why we, Tech Freedom, got involved in this most recent round of litigation, not just on our own behalf, but on behalf of entrepreneurs and investors and inventors in Silicon Valley who are primarily focused on real-time video conferencing and other services that are extremely latency or jitter, sort of technical terms, dependent. So that's our view. The FCC's view was basically that they would highly disfavor those, and essentially that they would be presumed to be illegal. And I think that's a crazy, bright line per se rule. And what you need is a more flexible rule that asks, is it good for consumers? Are consumers in control? Who's really being harmed here? That's the way the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice under an antitrust suit, or even a state antitrust suit, would have to look at a case like this.
Sure. Now, I want to return to an issue that you brought up earlier that often is not associated with this debate, but really should be, and that's the barriers to entry, oftentimes government created. So can you get into a little more detail there of what we mean by the barriers to entry and what some of those barriers are and how governments at all levels help to create these barriers?
So we talked about this a little bit earlier, and it's not that you're ever going to have a dozen broadband providers just because of the nature of the market. It's very capital intensive to deploy broadband. But the big obstacle to broadband deployment is government. It's primarily local government, and some of it is red tape and bureaucracy. And it's things like Seattle and San Francisco. Seattle, until recently, did not have a fiber-to-the-home network. San Francisco still does not. And the reason had to do with the permitting and all the nightmare you had to go through to deploy cabinets on the street, the metal boxes that have all the routing equipment in them. There are people who just fight that because they think it's ugly, or they imagine that it's going to give them cancer or whatever. Well, as soon as Seattle cleared the way to actually deploy those, CenturyLink started to deploy a fiber-to-the-home network, right? So that's a good example. Austin and Kansas City cut a lot of red tape, made things a lot easier for Google Fiber to deploy. So we want to see that kind of stuff happen, not just in cities, but the federal government is a big landowner, especially out west. And if you want to deploy to rural America, you have to deal not only with these sort of last mile problems, but also with the middle mile, where you've got to string fiber across hundreds of miles along interstate highways or state highways. And if you're crossing federal lands, it's not currently very easy to do that. You may get tied up for years dealing with, the Federal Indian Burial Grounds Act review or environmental review just for digging a micro trench that you put fiber in. So that's part of this is a purely libertarian answer to say that all that stuff should be easier, and it would make deployment easier in urban areas and rural areas and be good for everybody. Part of this, though, is also about smart infrastructure. This is not a left-wing or right-wing idea, but if the government's going to own the roads and the street lamps and so on, they should think carefully about making that stuff fiber-ready and upgradable, which would mean things like installing conduits under the asphalt or the sidewalks when you dig them up so that you can easily thread fiber through that. And you could have multiple companies putting fiber through that. And that same idea of conduits is even true for things like you wouldn't even think about as being related to broadband, but I mentioned the street lamps and the street lights and even parking meters. All of those things are actually capable of carrying 5G antennas. If you deployed them smartly as a city, you would want to buy ones that have power and fiber that runs up the pipe from the sidewalk, and the sidewalk feeds into a conduit. So you could have multiple private companies putting money into using those for broadband deployment and paying the city back. So it's not a subsidy, but it's just thinking ahead. So those are all ways where government is either doing too much as a matter of being too difficult to deal with, or is just not being smart about investing in next generation ready infrastructure. And we'd like to see both happen. And I think there is a broad bipartisan agreement that it should. There just hasn't been any political will to do much about it.
Sure. So what's the current status of net neutrality, and what would the enforcement of these rules actually look like?
Well, there are two things going on right now about net neutrality. One is there's a lawsuit that we're part of that is now, we lost at the initial round of a 3-judge panel. We were challenging the underlying legal basis for the 2015 net neutrality rules, saying the FCC doesn't really have any legal authority here, and this should be left to those other vehicles and other agencies that I mentioned. That is before now the full D.C. Circuit, and it's in general not likely that the D.C. Circuit will reverse a panel. But in this case, we got a very strong dissent from one of the 3 judges on the panel who agreed with us. So it's possible the D.C. Circuit could also agree with us, and the case could also make its way up to the Supreme Court. But I think at this point, it's probably more likely that that whole thing gets short-circuited because, of course, as the outgoing Democratic FCC chairman said gloatingly last summer, elections have consequences. When he was trying to ram his agenda through, he was very adamant about that. And for better or worse, Republicans won the last election, and they're going to run the FCC now. And they're going to start, in my opinion, by undoing the legal claims of authority that underlay the open internet order. And when they do that, this issue is going to revert back to the Federal Trade Commission. So we're essentially going to roll back the videotape to 2008 and start having to figure out how the FTC brings enforcement actions when it needs to, as it did in at least that case I mentioned about throttling of wireless data. So that's going to be, I think, the new normal, and that could happen very quickly. It's not going to require a lengthy notice and comment process. It's a pure legal question the FCC can resolve on its own, and the Federal Trade Commission is going to take over. And then the issue is going to be up to Congress and what they want to do about it, and whether there's going to be a legislative deal to transfer the issue back to the FCC, as Republicans had proposed 2 years ago, or whether they'll say, well, the FTC is the better answer, and that's where it should have been all along, and let's figure out how to do that. And personally, I think that's the best answer. We should make that permanent. Of course, that's going to require Democratic votes, probably, and that may not be possible. So the compromise may end up being that the issue does get stuck back at the FCC. But this sort of back and forth, this may sound unimportant to people who don't care about alphabet soup agencies or these fine legal differences, but it really matters because the FTC, at the end of the day, has broad authority and it can be quite aggressive. But it does have to show that what it's doing is good for consumers, and sometimes that's as simple as saying consumers were promised X, they didn't get X, we could bring in a deception action. Or industry has a code of conduct, they're not living up to it, we enforce that, in addition to all the antitrust laws and their more general authority to argue that certain practices are unfair because they cause more harm than benefit. I think that's a better way to regulate than the FCC, which even former Democratic chief economists of the FCC had ridiculed the agency in the last few years, saying it had become an economics-free zone, uninterested in actually weighing costs and benefits or thinking carefully about how to regulate smartly. So I just think the FCC is, frankly, a fundamentally broken agency, and we should be trying to move away from it as fast as we can and to do so responsibly. And that would mean transferring staff over to the Federal Trade Commission, building them up as a really capable Federal Technology Commission. It's a term I coined a few years ago. And I think it's true. That's what they regulate all technology. I don't see why they shouldn't be regulating broadband just as much as they regulate Google and Facebook. And then we can argue about exactly how to do that and where the right balance is. But we're more likely to strike it there than at the FCC, which is really nothing to do with consumers and everything to do with politics and special interests.
Sure, and I know we're running out of time, but there are two more questions I want to get to very quickly. And the first one is around this idea of a common carrier, because we often hear that issue brought up in this discussion. So what is a common carrier, and how does the concept of a common carrier apply to this whole debate over net neutrality?
Well, I mentioned Title II. That is the provision of the 1934 Communications Act, the New Deal legislation that governed the old AT&T telephone monopoly as a common carrier. And that term is the same term that was applied to railroads. It's a term that has its origins in the Middle Ages and how you dealt with toll roads and ferry crossings and canals and so on. And the long and short of it is that a common carrier is someone that holds itself out to the public to offer service to all comers. So if you were crossing England on your way to Canterbury Cathedral to make a pilgrimage, the inns and the roads and so on would be common carriers, and they had certain duties as common carriers, and there was a legal mechanism that was developed to regulate them. Well, that framework really, I don't think makes sense in the modern landscape. I mean, if you have a competitive market, right? We're no longer talking about AT&T, which has an actual monopoly, right? We're talking about multiple competing providers, not as many as I'd like to see, but at least two strong competitors in the vast majority of America. That framework starts to break down because common carriage regulation really, in my view, is a recipe for monopoly. In other words, it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's some data that suggests that actually invoking common carriage regulation, which includes price regulation, for example, has driven down investment. And the FCC will say, well, don't worry about it because we're not imposing all of common carrier regulation. We're just imposing Title II light. The problem is, and this is again is sort of an inside baseball legal thing, but it's important. That's not actually how the FCC works. Once you designate someone as a common carrier, the FCC acquires vast powers, and those include the power to set prices and unbundle access, as I mentioned, happens in Europe, right? Which is the thing that broadband providers are most afraid of, because that would mean that you would have just give up on competition, you have a regulated monopoly. And all those things are things the FCC has the power to do. They just say they're not going to do them now, but they've opened the door to that. And the only way to really close that door and say we're going to have a competitive market and encourage companies to enter the market and to try to win consumers from each other, the only way to do that is to take Title II, to take common carriage regulation off the table. And that's something that isn't just a right-wing idea. There were something like 50 Democrats that felt that way, at least a few years ago, including the Congressional Black Caucus. And that's because they understood that when you impose that kind of heavy-handed legal regime, it's people on the margins that suffer most. It's not the people in the suburbs where service is profitable and are going to keep getting investments and upgrades. It's people who are really where the companies have to make decisions on the margins, which is how all decisions are made, and decide, is it worth investing an extra amount of money here to get service? And they were worried that sort of regulation was going to hurt them, and I think rightly so.
All right, and one final question for you. And ordinarily I would wrap up by asking about solutions and where this is headed, but you've done a pretty good job of discussing that already, so I want to turn our attention elsewhere before we wrap up. And I want to ask you about other attempts outside of net neutrality to regulate and control the internet, as well as what the big companies and the major players in this space, in the tech world, have to say about net neutrality and about internet regulations and control.
Well, that's a broad question.
It is. That's true.
Unfortunately, this debate over net neutrality has essentially sucked all the oxygen out of the room. So the reason you asked me on the show today to talk about this is when people think about internet regulation, this is all that most people think about. And if they know of anything else, they know about attempts to crack down on copyright policing, and that was the SOPA debate 4 or 5 years ago. They might know about there was a similarly much hyped bill called CISA about cybersecurity. There are so many other things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis here at Tech Freedom. I think I would just mention one in particular that your listeners should be aware of. So to me, the real guarantee of internet freedom, the thing that keeps the internet open and free, is that you have, it's really two things. Number one, you have these platforms that we all enjoy every day. Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, all those services are platforms. Xbox Live is a platform. It hosts content that users create. The reason that those things have taken off and that America leads the world, at least in part, in those services, that is in part because the United States is unique in not holding those platforms liable for the content that their users post. So for copyright, they do have a legal responsibility to review and take down infringing material. And whatever you think of that, it's at least something that can be implemented, not necessarily well, or perfectly, but it's that system works to some degree. But on the rest of user content, if those companies had an obligation to take down, let's say, defamatory material or any material that violates a state criminal law, of which there are almost an infinite number, including defamation and all sorts of crazy little things that you never know about unless you take criminal law, years of criminal law in school or practicing criminal lawyer. If you open the door to that kind of liability, those services many of them are going to go out of business, and all of them are going to change how they work. They're going to crack down on the ability of users to be able to post content, and users themselves are going to essentially acquire heckler's veto. You could allege that someone's content is harassing or hate speech or whatever that might be, right, and have it taken down. So this is a fight about another law called Section 230, which is, in my view, the real bedrock of internet freedom, and it is very much under assault. Every single state attorney general last year signed a letter arguing that that state criminal law should be exempted from that immunity so that states could bring lawsuits against those platforms like Yelp, just because there's content on there that might violate some obscure criminal law. So that would be a terrible thing, and your listeners should know about that. And that's, I think, the chief domestic threat. And you could very well see some crackdown from this administration, especially given the way that the president's talked about opening up the libel laws. And then internationally, what makes the internet work around the world is the free flow of data, the ability to open up the same service in another country and interact with users wherever. And that's also under assault because for somewhat similar reasons, law enforcement around the world and some protectionists in foreign countries are trying to stop that free flow of data and to force companies, for example, to store user data in that country. And they say it's because they're afraid of the NSA. Well, really, it's because they want their own national security agencies or law enforcement agencies to be able to get easy access to that data or to surveil everything that goes on with that. So open flow of data across borders, critical issue, and we could do another show about that, but let's just say that there are some important cases that are going to be coming down the pike, and the Europeans may end up actually trying to crack down on this even more than they already have. So that's the kind of thing that we watch here at Tech Freedom. It's not just net neutrality, it's those issues and a wide range of other legal and regulatory threats to the internet and to other evolving technologies like drones or home sharing or vaping. We try to cover all of those under the mantle of Tech Freedom.
Well, great, and thank you so much for joining me today. Obviously, there are a lot of topics and questions that might be raised in someone's mind after hearing our conversation. So if someone wants to learn more about the sorts of things we've been discussing during this episode, what resources would you direct them to, and what are the best ways to follow your work in particular?
Well, again, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We're Tech Freedom on each of those. That's easy. Of course, we have a podcast, and if you are a podcast listener, a regular one, you should subscribe to the Tech Policy Podcast. We have been around for just over a year. We celebrated our anniversary, I think, last week, and we're up to episode 150-some. So there's an endless library there of material, some of which is me blabbing on as I have today, some of which is other people. Most of it, frankly, is other more interesting people talking about all sorts of tech issues, from sharing economy to surveillance to drones, to supersonic flight. I mean, we really cover a wide range of things, space law being one of my pet topics. There are a few episodes about that. And finally, we do have that Medium publication I mentioned, the Tech Policy Corner, and you should expect to see more from us on that. So if you have any questions, reach out to us on Twitter. Happy to take them. We always look for suggestions for the podcast, for episodes or guests. So let us know.
Okay, well, great. And I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/net-neutrality, and all of those resources that we've mentioned over the course of the interview and that you just mentioned in that last question will be linked to from the show notes page. So again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/net-neutrality. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, and also rate and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher so that you can get all the latest episodes and stay up to date and not miss any. And Baron, thank you so much for your time today and for helping to go over a very confusing topic for so many people. So hopefully it's less confusing after hearing this. And there are obviously many more topics that we could discuss. So hopefully you'll be able to come back on the show at some point in the future and we can discuss a different topic then.
Sure. Happy to do it.
All right. Well, thanks
for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.